Legion, it's Hadrian. Thank you for being here, and welcome back to Strategy School in Civilization VI Rise and Fall. Don't forget to check out the series overview if you're watching for the very first time. But I wanted to jump in before I even start with the topic for today's episode, which is going to be, as I mentioned, tile yields and settling your first city, the basics of the basics. I want to talk, first of all, about kind of a lesson zero, which is related to hotkeys. So if we go straight into the options menu first and foremost, there are a couple of hotkeys that you can set that will really make your life a good bit easier. Now, most of the hotkeys that I'm going to talk about in a second are already set, like these right here especially. But the one I'm talking about is the next action hotkey. I actually am going to clear this binding for this series in order to avoid some temptation for me. But binding next action to N is not done by default, and it's one of the best things you can do for yourself as a Civilization VI player, because what it does is it allows you to have your hand on a key that you can just continuously press, and it will toggle whatever is going on down here. So maybe you haven't played Civilization yet, maybe you really are a brand new player and you're just diving in for the first time, and that doesn't mean anything to you yet. But even if you've played 20 turns, you understand how useful it can be to have a key set up for hitting this instead of having to constantly go back and forth and click it. But for my purposes, because I don't want to rush, especially once the tutorial gets going, I'm going to keep that turned off for this series. I want to let you know that it exists, though. So the other hotkeys that I mentioned are, of course, the G hotkey, which turns the grid for the map on and off. Always a good thing to know if you want to use. If you want to have a more realistic looking map, you can turn it off. But then the G hotkey, again, will let you see the exact number of tiles. And because Civilization VI is kind of a virtual board game, in a sense, it is useful to be able to actually see the places on the map. You can see them without having the tile turned on. You can tell that these are tiles. You can tell the hexagons exist, but it's useful to have that turned on for, I think, a lot of folks. And then also there is the Q key, which allows you to see specifically what bonus resources are on each tile. It's not too invasive as an interface element. You can turn it off if you don't like it. I'm going to leave it on because it does help us just eyeball what is near this start location, which we are going to be talking about in just a second. And then finally, there is the Y key, which turns on yields. Now, I normally leave this off because it kind of clutters the screen a bit. Sometimes I can leave it on by accident when I get carried away. But we are going to leave this on for now because we are about to talk about some of the icons you are looking at. As a matter of fact, we're going to be talking about every single one of the icons you're looking at, with the exception maybe of one. So with that being said, I'm going to turn the world tracker back on. You can toggle this on and off anytime you want. If you have it off, your progress on your current science and culture projects will show up here. But if you have it on, you'll actually see the specifics of whatever you're researching in both science and culture. We're going to devote the next episode to these two trees and how Civilization VI is different in this regard. But let's go ahead and talk about what is the very first thing. The very first thing that you need to know as a Civilization VI player, especially if you are brand new. Civilization VI, as you are probably aware, is a turn-based strategy game. And every single turn, you earn what are called yields. Now, there are a number of types of yields. The primary types are the ones you see when we turn the yield icons on, because they are unique to every tile, and they are also, as you can see, common to every tile. So the two most common, of course, are food and production. And then, of course, there's gold as well. Those are the three basic yield types. You can also get faith from tiles. That's the one that we might not talk about as much. You can also get science from tiles, and you can get culture from tiles, which helps with these. But the very first thing that I want you to understand is that when you are playing a game of Civilization VI, when you are good at playing Civilization VI, when someone else beats you at Civilization VI, what they have beaten you with is the tile game. They have understood the yields, and they have played the map around them to maximum effect. That's how you play and win Civilization VI, is understanding how yields work and how they help you when you use them properly and when you focus on them and when you make sure that they're properly balanced for whatever your strategy is. So let's start with food. What does food do for you? What is the purpose of having lots of food? Food ensures population growth. Now, there are some things that can set upper limits, but for now, all you need to understand is that the more food a city has, the faster new citizens will arrive, and therefore the more tiles it will be able to work, and the more food or production or whatever is on those tiles it will be able to bring in. So that's what food does for you. Production is how fast, as you might imagine, you are able to build things. The more production you have built up in the tiles you're working around your city and in your city center, which is an area where you can have production in the beginning, it's the only area where you can have production in the beginning, as a matter of fact, except for one tile where your first citizen is working. We'll talk about that in a second. The more production you have, the faster your buildings will build. And there is literally, for production, every single thing that you can build has a production value, an amount of production that you have to generate. So something might cost, and this is just off the top of my head, 60 production. So whatever your production per turn is for a city, you just do the math, and it's going to take that many turns to build up to 60, however many it is, in order for you to get that unit trained or building built or whatever it is you're trying to produce. Gold is also very important because not only does it allow you to buy these things outright rather than build them and wait several turns for them to build, which can be very handy in the early game if you establish a strong income of gold, but also gold allows you to trade with other players. Gold is currency. It lets you say to another player, hey, I have a lot of gold. You have a resource that I want, though, that I don't have. And I want to give you a certain amount of gold per turn for it. I want to give you a certain amount of gold just in a lump sum. I want to give you this resource that I have in exchange for your resource. That's trade, and we'll get into that in a later video. But gold allows you not only to purchase things immediately and not have to wait, but also trade with other players. So building up a lot of gold early on can also be useful. And there's lots of ways to do it, but the primary way that you build up these things is through these yields and working the tiles around your initial city. So those are the basics of yields. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below, and we will probably touch on that topic again and again in these early episodes while I kind of work you through some of my initial decisions and show you how you can manipulate the game to give you what you want for each city. So with that being said, speaking of what you want for each city, this is our very first city. How do you know? Like, this is the question that comes up. How do you know that this is where you want to settle? What are some things that you can look at to determine whether or not this is going to be a good starting city? Now, I will tell you, based on my experience, this map actually started us on a pretty good tile, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But in general, what you want to ask yourself when you're settling any city is, well, do I want this city to have a growth focus or a production focus from the outset? Most tiles in the game, when you found a city, no matter what their initial yields are, most tiles will give you a city that has 2 food and 1 production. So the opposite of this tile here. So 2 food, 1 production, a little bit more growth than production. It is possible, however, to skew the scales even further in one direction or the other. For instance, if you settle on top of a rice tile, you will have a city that has 3 food and 1 production. So what did I just tell you about food a moment ago? That means that you will actually grow, especially early on when that much food matters a lot to the fact that you just have 1 city, the fact that it's in the early game and every turn counts, which I will talk about in just a second as well, because some of you might already be wondering, hey, Hadrian, can we move? Like, is it good to move on the first turn? We'll talk about that at the end. But when you have a lot of food, think about that. The ability to grow your city quickly and have more citizens sooner allows you to work more tiles and therefore have more food, more production, more of everything in the area. But there are downsides to growing quickly as well. So you just have to make that decision for yourself. Or do you want a production focus? Do you want to be able to build and train units more quickly in the beginning of the game? If you want to do that, then you want to start a city on, well, the kind of tile that we're standing on right now. Plains Hills are one of the only tiles in the game. By the way, you can just move the mouse over any tile in the game. You can see at the very top of the tooltip what the tile type is. So this is Plains. These are Plains Hills. So it's very easy to tell immediately. By the way, another thing that you can set, if you go into Options and Interface, I have the tooltip delay set for 0.2 seconds. I strongly suggest you do about the same. Setting it to instantaneous can be a little obnoxious because the tooltip never goes away. Imagine tooltips just floating around everywhere I go right now. If you have a little bit of a delay on it, it just creates a slightly cleaner screen for you. But that's how you can kind of determine whether or not you are on a Plains Hills tile. And the thing about a Plains Hills tile is this will actually start a 2 food, 2 production city. Now that's an extra production, double the production that you would have in that center city tile for the rest of the game. Not double production for the whole city, not double production for the rest of the tiles that might be worked by the citizens, but for that 1 tile, for the 1 initial component of that city, especially again in the early game when that 1 tile is such a huge component of the territory you control, that double production will be huge. It will mean that you build things not literally twice as fast, but almost twice as fast. We'll talk about why not literally a little bit later on. That's a little bit more detailed, but just understand, again, production determines how fast you build things. Food determines how fast you grow. So what kind of focus do you want to have early on? I really urge you to experiment with the different types of tiles that you can settle on. There are other possibilities as well if you settle on actual resource tiles like this cotton down here. So it's possible to have cities that actually have gold per turn based on what some of the adjacent tiles are, or based on what you literally settle on top of. So really fool around and figure out what the different possibilities are. Some of the most common ones are the ones I mentioned. Plains hills, if you want to have a production focus, or settle on a rice tile, which we don't have any rice tiles near us. We can't see any. But settle on a rice tile if you would like to have some food as an early option. So there's that. Second of all, when you are thinking about a city location, and this applies both to your initial city and it applies to any city that you settle or conquer afterwards, what you want to do is look at your surrounding tiles as well, particularly the tiles that surround the initial tile, because these are the first ones that are going to be workable. As your city grows, it will expand out into the second ring of tiles, and your workers can work up to 3 tiles away from any city in your empire. There are mods that enable workers to work farther. I don't know of any settings in the vanilla game that allow that to change. I don't think there are now. There may be in the future, because there's all kinds of things that change the rules based on decisions that you can make and ways that you can have things play to your favor. But by default, a worker can work up to 3 tiles away from a city if that tile is within that city's territory. It might be outside of your territory, it might be in another one of your city's territory, but if it's in that city's territory and within 3 tiles, so up to here, your workers can work it. So you want to think first of all about the initial tiles that are going to be workable. Now this is a really great tile. We have a bananas tile, so we know that right away we're going to have a tile that will have 3 food and 2 production. This is a really good start location because of that, because not only will we have the Plains Hills start with the extra production, but we also are going to have the extra food and production from the bananas tile, and we won't even have the tile improved yet. We'll talk about improvements later on too, because you can change all of these values to work them to your favor and play towards your strategy. All of this stuff can be manipulated. But what you want to think about is, where are your workers going to be able to work? Are you settling on a settling on a tile that might look good for the city, like for instance a Plains Hills tile, but then every tile around it is like this, just a plains tile, nothing really interesting? Is the city maybe not on a river? That's something else you have to think about for reasons I'm going to talk about in just a second. So you're going to want to consider that, just because you want to have stuff like this. You want to have at least 1 or 2 tiles, like we can see here, where there's a heightened food and production value to having the tile. Or if you can imagine improving the tile and having that works too. But ideally, you want that heightened value just from the base tiles like we see here. And then next, you want to think about, and this is getting into the weeds a little bit, and I don't want to overwhelm you, but I'm trying to give you all the information that you need for the basic decision, even though some of it is going to come in later episodes in detail. You do also slightly want to think about district placement, and that's worth mentioning now, because one of the core aspects that separates Civilization 6 from past entries in the series is very simply that when you have a city, that's not the only tile that matters to the actual building of the city. In Civilization 5, that was the case. In Civilization 6, you actually will build districts that are extensions of the city. This is a huge and separate topic, so I'm not going to go on a tangent here, but you want to be very mindful of cities that are not near jungles, that are not near mountains, because there are bonuses that you get to different district types, especially some of the early districts that you need to build, that you get from being near mountains or rivers or forest or whatever. And some of those bonuses, again, can be manipulated by choices that you make. You can set up some bonuses for yourself, either with the civilization that you choose or with some choices that you make about, for instance, religion in the early game. But you always have to think, even with your initial city, will I be able to build the districts that I need in this city? We'll talk about districts in a coming episode, and that will make more sense. But just know that that's going to be part of your decision as well. Finally, another thing that's going to be coming up in an episode very soon is, what are the resources that are nearby? We actually have some cattle. Like I said, we have bananas here. We have sheep here. So this is a really good starting location, because we even have a luxury resource, 2 luxury resources within 3 tiles of this city. So it's going to take a while before we can have access to those, but it's nice to see that we're starting out with some luxury resources nearby. And these bonus resources, again, we'll talk more in detail about what these mean later on, but you're probably noticing that the primary benefit of these resources, luxury or bonus, doesn't matter. There's also a type of resource called strategic resources with a red background. you're probably noticing that they have heightened yields compared to tiles of the same type. So this is a grassland tile. It has 3 food. A grassland tile without cattle is 2 food. So you can get that bonus without having the animal husbandry. But having animal husbandry allows you to improve the tile and have even more food than the 3 food. So don't let that fool you when it says requires animal husbandry. You can have that tile in your territory and you can take advantage of that 3 food right away. But improving the tile means it can get even better. And so being able to judge, I like the number of bonus resources that are near this tile. That's something that's going to be really important as well. One last thing, and this is the last bit of the basics that I want to cover without going into detail. This applies more to cities that you settle later on. We're actually going to dedicate an entire episode, probably in 4 or 5 episodes, to this topic as well as the other topics that I've just mentioned. I'm trying not to bombard you with everything. If I went into detail about everything that I just discussed and all the things that go into the decision around a city, this episode would be way too long and it'd be way too much information. So I'm just telling you for now, there are other topics you might want to look into. So we've got districts, right? We've talked about resource types. We're going to have episodes dedicated to both of those. And then finally, we are going to have an episode dedicated to city management, including housing and amenities. And this is one of the things we'll cover in that episode. The settler map is something that'll pop up anytime you have a settler other than your starting settler selected. And what this does is it shows you what the best tiles in terms of housing would be in terms of placing your city. So notice that there are bright green tiles, there are light green tiles, which we actually can't see any right now. There are these tiles, so there's tiles with no water, and there are tiles that you literally can't settle for various reasons. So when you turn the settler lens on, you can see that in your starting city, you need to have a really, really, really good reason for not having a starting city on a bright green tile, because this is going to give you the most housing, and that is going to ensure the most early game growth. When we have the city episode, the city management episode, we'll talk more about why that is. So finally, before I end this first episode, because I've just given you a lot of information to think about and probably a lot to ask questions about, but the question that I mentioned earlier in the episode that we're going to put off till the end is this. Well, should you move? Having learned all of that and having, maybe practiced with this and watched some of the later episodes after they come out in this tutorial, or just played yourself, when do you move? When do you decide that your initial location is not good enough, but there's a tile that's nearby that if you can just move there, you can potentially settle that tile instead? First of all, it is possible, in the case of, for instance, this tile, to move without using up all of your unit's movement. So you can still, in some cases, move your settler and settle your city in the first turn. But of course, the essence of the question is sacrificing turns. What if I have to move and it takes up a turn? What if I can't settle my first city where I really want to settle it until turn 2 or turn 3 or even turn 4? What do I do? First of all, it's entirely based on how confident you are as a player that you can make up for that lost turn or 2 or 3. I wouldn't risk more than that, but it really comes down to what you feel like the tile you're going for can give you. If you're going to give up 5 turns for a starting tile, but you can confidently say to yourself that by the end of the game, or, at least, soon enough in the game, and that depends on difficulty level, because, playing on the high level, especially playing on Deity or even on Immortal, the issue with not settling your city on your first turn is that you have to play catch up to the AI because of all the bonuses they get from the very beginning. So sacrificing turns can be dicey, but in lower difficulty settings, as long as you are confident that you can make up for whatever you lose, then I say go for it. Is the tile you're moving to going to allow you to do that? And how soon will it allow you to do that? That's how you determine whether you should move in your first turn or 2 with your starting settler. So with that, that's all I'm going to cover in this first episode, because I know that was a lot of information. This is a very typical strategy game tutorial in that we haven't even played yet. We've just been staring at our settler. I am going to go ahead and settle my first city of Uruk here. And of course we have, notice what happened. The first citizen automatically went out to this tile because it is the best tile to work. And we can talk about how to play with that later on, or you can play with it yourself and figure some stuff out. But we have 1 citizen right now, and in 4 turns, we're going to have 2, and we're going to talk more in the next episode about some of the next decisions we need to make, because now notice that the game is telling me to choose research. So what is research like in Civilization 6? Why is there a whole separate tree that says Code of Laws on it? What's going on here? And it's colored purple like culture. What does that have to do with anything? If you're a Civilization 5 player that hasn't read about this, you're going to want to pay attention in the next episode, because they really changed the way that research works. Not drastically, but they expanded it in Civilization 6. And if you're new, we're going to cover all the details of how to go about your first research and civics decisions and more of that information. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to follow along. New episodes are going to be coming out every other day at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Comments are always welcome. Let me know what you think, and I will see you next time.